the remote countryside of Missouri, a widow named Clara quietly raises her children by grinding beans to make milk every night. Until one winter night, she discovers a bald ghost silently grinding beans for her as a way to repay her kindness. From then on, her life changes. Her children become successful. She lives in peace. But when the secret is revealed, death comes, and one spirit must give up everything to keep her final promise. A magical, touching story of kindness, gratitude, and the silent millstones that keep turning, even when no one is watching. Willow Creek was not a place that tourist maps would have mentioned. It was nestled among the corn hills and sun-scorched prairies of central Missouri. A place where the last half-mile of paved roads gave way to red dirt and gravel. There, 12 miles from the nearest town, was where Clara Whitmore lived in an old log farmhouse that people had called Elm House because of the 3 old elms that stood brooding at the edge of the front yard. Once upon a time, the place had been prosperous. Her husband, Henry Whitmore, was a woodturner who had built every door frame and every kitchen tile with his own hands. He loved the earth, the smell of damp wood, and he loved Clara with the same steadfast love as the floors they built together, rough, solid, unpretentious. But that spring, a board broke, a slip in the factory, and Henry fell from the 2nd floor onto the cement. He died. Clara, then 33, was a widow with a 4-year-old son and a pile of unpaid bills. Jacob, her only son, was the only reason she got up in the morning. He had his father's grey eyes, curly hair, and a habit of wrinkling his nose when he was thinking. He never whined, never asked why dinner was cornflakes and beans, never complained that his coat was always old and patched. Clara was grateful for that, but the more grateful she was, the more indebted she felt. She couldn't let her son grow up without a chance. She couldn't let Henry's death be in vain. So she began grinding beans. The mill she used wasn't electric. It was an old maple hand mill with an iron blade and a slightly off-axis crank, requiring the full weight of the person to move it. Clara placed the mill near the kitchen window, where there was a cool breeze and early morning light. Every morning before Jacob got up, she got up at 4 o'clock, lit the stove, boiled water, soaked the beans, and began grinding. Each turn was slow and laborious. She often hummed to herself as she turned it, old nursery rhymes that Henry had taught Jacob. The creaking of the mill blended with the distant crowing of roosters, creating a distinct, patient morning music. The ground bean water was filtered through a coarse cloth and boiled over a wood stove. When it cooled, she poured it into glass jars and hand-labeled it. Whitmore soy milk, no preservatives, no deception. Every Saturday, she loaded them onto a rusty handcart. Jacob went with her, and the 2 of them pulled the cart for nearly 2 hours to the town market. The market was small but cozy, located next to the church and the post office. The customers were mostly acquaintances. Mrs. Good with her herbs, Mr. Tuck with his salted duck eggs, and the Marlowe sisters who sold spicy cornbread. Clara was not a good talker. She smiled little, but her eyes were sincere. Gradually, people remembered her for the way she put down her milk bottle without forcing a purchase, and for the way Jacob always bowed to adults despite his torn heels. Even so, the income from the soy milk was only enough to pay half the electricity bill, buy a few notebooks, and some rice. She had to work extra jobs growing vegetables in the summer, doing hand sewing in the winter, and sometimes gardening for larger farms. There were nights when Clara fell asleep on the wooden table, her hands still smelling of raw beans and candle wax. Jacob would cover his mother with a blanket and quietly study by the kerosene lamp. The boy never complained. Clara often woke up in the middle of the night and saw her son leaning over a book, the yellow light reflecting off his long eyelashes and thin hands. She told herself, "I must try harder." Winter came. It was colder than usual. The mill was heavier because the wood had shrunk. Clara could feel the age on her shoulders. Her knuckles cracked from the wind. Her knees ached as she climbed the attic stairs. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Jacob had just said he wanted to go to Columbia High School, a boarding school with scholarships, but with very high requirements. Clara nodded, smiled, and silently counted the number of milk bottles she had to sell each week to have enough money to buy study books every night. Clara stayed after Jacob went to bed, grinding beans for the next day. There were nights when the snow covered the roof. The fireplace went out because it had run out of wood, and her hands were so cold that she couldn't hold the mill handle. She wrapped herself in a blanket, lit the only candle she had left, and continued grinding. Turn by turn, the mill made a sound like an old man's sigh. Each creak was a silent prayer she sent to her son's future. Even if she had to change her life, she wanted him to go further than this field. Early one morning, when Clara opened the lid of the soy milk container, she was stunned. The batch of milk was unusually full. The milk container yesterday was only half milled. Clara frowned. Did she forget? No. She remembered very clearly. Her hands hurt so much that she had to stop early. At that time, she just sighed and planned to continue grinding the next morning. But now, the milk was full, smooth, and smelled more fragrant than usual. She said nothing. She just sat by the window, holding a glass of milk, looking out at the distant elm trees. The sky was ashen grey. Snow began to fall lightly. She thought, "I'm dreaming," but that was not the last dream. For the next night, something strange happened for the first time. Clara heard a rattling sound from the barn, though she had never been there. The sound of the mill, not the wind, not the mice, but the sound of the mill turning. There was no one in the house but her and Jacob, and from the woodshed, a yellow light like that of an oil lamp shone through the crack in the door. Clara put down her glass of milk, slowly stood up, put on her old, worn sweater, take the lantern, and walked toward the wooden door that was shaking slightly, where the cycle of something strange had begun, unknown to her. Clara stopped in front of the door of the woodshed, which was used only for storing the mill, the beanbags, and a few old garden tools. Her hand rested lightly on the latch. Inside, the rattling was steady, like the heartbeat of a person at work. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of the mill turning, so familiar it sent a shiver down her spine. Clara took a deep breath. The yellow light from the lantern filtered through her fingers as she pushed the door open. It creaked, the door opened, and she stood still. Beside the handmill stood a creature, tall, gaunt, bald as a pebble, worn by the rain. His old grey clothes were covered in dirt, hunched shoulders, thin arms, skin as pale as forgotten candle wax. He was turning the mill, properly, steadily, skillfully. Clara did not scream. She had lived long enough to know that there were things scarier than ghosts, like loneliness, like bills piling up, like a winter night without firewood. The creature stopped, turned. Its eyes were hollow, almost pupilless, but they still shone with something human. I didn't steal, it said. Its voice was hoarse, like someone who had just walked through many cold winds. Clara didn't answer. Her hand still held the lamp, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the stranger. I'm hungry, it continued, bowing its head. I only drank some soy milk the other day, and yesterday I paid for it by grinding the rest of the beans. Clara looked at the mortar clean, the way she had always kept it. The mortar was dust-free, the blade glinting faintly from the oil lamp. She nodded. For some reason she didn't know, not out of trust, not exactly out of fear, perhaps out of tiredness. I was a miller once, the creature continued. In Tennessee, a long time ago. I remember the crank. I remember the smell of beans. That kept me something. Are you a man? I was. It chuckled. I'm not sure now. Clara gripped the lamp. What's your name? I've forgotten. But they used to call me Noah the Hand, because my hands never rested. Clara was silent for a long time. Then she put the lamp down on the old three-legged stool and said, If you want to mill, do it right. Every night. No trouble. No threats. Noah bowed his head. No one ever agreed like you. Clara never asked again that night. Every dusk, she washed the mill, put the beanbag beside it, and tidied up the woodshed. And every morning, when she woke up, the milk was ground, filtered and sealed. The soy milk was full, more than usual, and surprisingly, better. The aroma was light and creamy, naturally sweet. Customers began to return to her stall at the market. Mrs. Gargood said, This is the first time I've had it without sugar. Mr. Tuck laughed. You've kept the secret recipe. Clara just smiled, a strange smile, both grateful and a little silent. Jacob noticed that his mother was less tired. She no longer forgot meals. She no longer fell asleep at the table like before. Instead, they ate dinner together. She began to help him study for exams, reading difficult math problems, reviewing the English grammar she had learned in the library. She even made a canvas book bag for him, embroidered with small handwritten words, Go with what is good. Clara never mentioned Noah, not to anyone, not to pray, not to write, but every night, when the kitchen light went out, she would look toward the barn and whisper, Thank you. Only once did Noah speak again. When Clara went to the barn to get more rice, he was standing silently at the mill, doing nothing, just looking through the crack in the door. Once, Noah said slowly, I had a daughter. She liked soy milk, but I was poor and couldn't buy it. I make it for your daughter. He turned, as if to make amends. Clara didn't know what to say. She just put the bag of rice down and left. For the first time, she saw tears in Noah's eyes in those deep pits. A few months passed. Jacob received a letter saying he had been accepted to a boarding school at Columbia. He hugged his mother, tears streaming down his face. Clara didn't cry. She just sat down on the chair, still holding the spoon to stir the corn porridge, her shoulders shaking from time to time. That night, she went to the warehouse, without a lamp. Mr. Noah, she called softly, can you help me for a while longer? There was no answer, just the sound of the millstone, turning steadily, gently, as promised. That spring, Clara left Willow Creek for the first time in nearly 20 years. A nearly 10-hour train ride took her to Washington, D.C., where Jacob, now federal judge Jacob Whitmore, rented an old house on Naylor Street, with its black iron fence and red maple trees that glowed in October. Clara didn't have much to carry: a few winter clothes, 2 old notebooks, a miniature wooden mortar as a souvenir, and a small wooden box with a lock, carefully placed in the bottom of her suitcase. The box never rang, never vibrated, never revealed anything special, but she knew Noah was in there. The day she left the farm, Clara went to the woodshed at dusk. She turned on the lantern, left the last bag of beans by the mortar, and stood there for a long time. "Noah," she said, "I'm not sure you want to leave this place, but I think it's time you had a home." From the darkness, a small voice called out, "Wherever someone needs my hand to grind, I will come." Clara held out the old wooden box. No one said anything more. A light breeze blew through the storage room. The door rattled. Clara locked the box, put it in her suitcase, and did not look back. Life was different in D.C. It took Clara a few weeks to get used to the honking of cars instead of roosters, the smell of urban smoke instead of the familiar smell of rotting wood. Jacob's rented house had a small attic room she loved. It had a window overlooking a deserted park, where a few old people played chess in the morning. She placed the wooden box on her desk, unlocked, but never opened. At night, when the lights were off, she sometimes heard the faint sound of the mill turning, not very clearly, as if from memory or from some invisible depth. Clara was not afraid. Only occasionally would he place a fresh bowl of beans by the window, a way of keeping a soul from feeling lost. Jacob was completely clueless. He loved his mother, but he didn't care much for her strange past. He was consumed by work courts, filings, and the hustle and bustle of politics. He bought her a cell phone, but Clara often turned it off because she didn't understand the buttons. He took her to the Kennedy Theatre, where she listened to classical music while quietly fiddling with the hem of her patched sleeve. One night, Jacob walked into his mother's room. "Mum," he said, pointing to a wooden box on the table. "What is this? It looks like an antique." Clara put down her teacup, a little startled. "It's a keepsake," she said, her voice low. "From your father." Jacob nodded, unconvinced, but the thought of the strange box lingered in his mind for days. One rainy afternoon, Clara was at the supermarket when Jacob, out of curiosity, opened the box. Just a small crack. No light, no sound, just a cold feeling coming from inside. The air around her seemed to shrink. Jacob stepped back, and when a shadowy figure emerged from the bottom of the box, something tall, bald, with bony hands, he screamed, a hand gripping his heart, a sharp pain. He collapsed in the middle of the quiet room. Clara returned when it was almost dark. Jacob's door was ajar. In the dim light, she saw her son lying on the floor, his face pale. The box was empty. The lid was open. Nothing inside. Clara knelt down, shook her son. No response. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later. The doctor concluded stroke due to acute cardiogenic shock. Maybe, they said. He had a history that he didn't know about. Clara didn't argue. She just sat by the bedside, holding her dead son's hand, tears streaming silently. That night, she returned to her room, put the box back on the table, and whispered, "You owe me a life." The box disappeared the next morning. Clara wasn't surprised. She sat by the window, drinking tea in silence. A few days passed, and then, exactly a week later, Jacob woke up. The doctors were puzzled. His heart was beating normally. No brain damage, when asked. Jacob remembered only a long dream. He said he was standing in a white building, full of files. In front of him was a man in a black robe like a judge, reading aloud a list of mistakes. Beside him, a thin, bald creature, human, but not quite, was arguing fiercely over a green glass bottle. The man in black sighed, then nodded. Jacob felt himself being pulled back, as if from the depths of water. Then he woke up. Clara listened and smiled, sadly, that night. She wrote a single line in her notebook. One does not have to be alive to keep one's word. Autumn came late that year. The maple leaves on Naylor Avenue turned a burnt brown, as if they were falling one by one, following a farewell that had been written long ago. Clara walked more slowly. Her hair was almost completely white, but her eyes were the same, calm, distant, and always with something waiting behind each look. Jacob recovered miraculously, as if he had never died. But since the strange dream, he had changed, becoming more quiet, less argumentative, often leaving the office early to have dinner with his mother. "I have a feeling," he said at dinner one day, "that every day that remains is a gift, and I shouldn't spend it carelessly." Clara just nodded, her hands resting lightly on the table, saying nothing. One morning, as Clara was cutting mint leaves in the garden, she stopped in front of an old maple tree. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating shimmering streaks of light on the ground. She bent down and gently placed a small object in the middle of the raised roots, a miniature ceramic mill, the kind of old souvenir Jacob had bought from a store in Pennsylvania when he was a child. She touched the crank, and ever so slightly it turned. There was no wind, there was no mechanism, just a turn a full circle, then a stop. She wasn't surprised. She just smiled, put her hands on her knees, and sat down by the tree. From that day on, every morning when it was still foggy, the neighborhood gardener, Mr. Leroy, would find the old woman sitting under the tree, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, a cup of hot tea beside her, and the mill whirring softly. No one knew where the sound came from, but whenever someone asked, Clara would just say, "That's Noah, an old friend." They asked, "Almost." She replied, "Someone who doesn't need to be remembered, but stays to keep her word." Clara began to write a diary, not about herself, but about little things, the first milk of the winter, the handkerchief she embroidered for her unborn grandchild, and sometimes a single line like, "Last night I heard the sound of a millstone in my dreams, still turning." Jacob read them quietly later, when she was no longer there. One quiet afternoon, as Clara sat in her study, the last light of day streaming through the window, she put her pen down on the page and wrote the last line. There are promises that don't need to be engraved on stone, because they are kept by hand, by beans, and by heart. Then she leaned her head back against the back of the chair and closed her eyes. Her heart stopped beating in her sleep, as gently as a leaf falling from a branch, right on the most beautiful afternoon of the year. Clara Whitmore's funeral was simple, as she had wished no expensive flowers, no long speeches. Jacob just stood there, holding a small jar of soy milk his mother had made, and told a story that no one believed. There was a man who used to grind beans every night to help my mother raise me. He didn't want anything but a thank you, and he kept his word to the end. Everyone was silent, but as Jacob placed the jar of milk before the tombstone, the wind picked up, and from somewhere a rattling sound echoed. No one saw anything, but a little girl held her mother's hand and said softly, "Mummy, that tree sings. Later." Jacob built a wooden bench under the maple tree. On the back of the bench was a small hand-carved plaque. Not all mills need to be seen. Some just need to be heard. Not all mortars need to be seen. Some need only be heard. Below is a faint engraving, a woman turning a mortar, and a figure standing behind, not clear, but leaning. On autumn days, if one sits still long enough under that maple tree, when the wind blows, one will sometimes hear something quiet, ancient, like the grinding of beans, or the whisper of a grateful spirit. And if one turns around, one might see the little porcelain mortar turning once, just once, but enough to remind us that kindness, if it is quiet enough, sincere enough, never disappears.